Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits behind glass, watching who dares to claim its name. At 9:17 p.m., snow moved softly across Kendall Square, settling on the black rooflines of chauffeured luxury SUVs lined along Athenaeum Street, less than 12 miles from downtown Boston. The Colefax Biomedical Research Campus rose above the frozen pavement like a silent instrument built from glass and steel, its 42-foot lobby walls reflecting blue city light from the high towers beyond the Charles River. Inside, the air smelled of polished steel, sterile citrus cleaner, and expensive coffee cooling untouched in porcelain cups. Everything was polished so perfectly that even the lie seemed sterile. Dr. Imani Bellamy stood near the second-floor observation rail, one hand resting lightly on the brushed nickel edge, her deep brown skin warmed by the faint amber glow from the architectural lights behind her. Below her, 600 invited guests moved through the atrium in tailored coats and black dresses, murmuring beneath suspended LED panels that displayed rotating images of neural cells, clinical models, and the Colefax name in restrained silver type. The event had cost $3.8 million before the first camera even turned on, according to the private estimate Imani had seen 3 weeks earlier. She had approved none of the theatrics. Everett Colefax arrived at 9:24 p.m. through the west entrance, wearing a midnight Italian suit, a white shirt sharp enough to look architectural, and the easy smile of a man who believed a room became his the moment he entered it. He paused exactly where the media team had marked the floor with a thin strip of clear tape, turned his left shoulder toward the financial news camera, and let the photographers catch the clean line of his jaw against the blue-white lab lights. From the upper windows, Boston's skyline shimmered behind him, distant and cold, while snow tapped the glass like quiet fingers. He trusted reflection more than truth. For 8 years, Imani had built the invisible machinery beneath this night. The donor consortium, the ethics approvals, the restricted use endowment, the clinical advisory board, the biomedical data stewardship authority, and the foundational research funding lockbox that protected every dollar from vanity, misuse, and public spectacle. She had come from a 2-bedroom apartment outside Baltimore, from scholarship interviews in borrowed shoes, from late nights under library lights where ambition was not glamorous, only necessary. Everett had come from inheritance, press profiles, and a family name that opened doors before he had learned what was behind them. He mistook access for intelligence. At 9:31 p.m., Camille Arden stepped from the elevator beside him in a champagne silk dress that caught every light in the atrium, though every technical phrase around her seemed to pass by untouched. She smiled at the cameras, touched Everett's sleeve with practiced delicacy, and tilted her face toward the upper balcony, as if she understood lighting better than medicine. The communications director whispered that Camille would appear in the opening segment as a human face of innovation, a phrase Imani recognized from a draft she had rejected twice. The lie had been polished. Across the atrium, the research staff watched in tight silence, their white coats bright under the recessed lighting, their eyes shifting from Everett to Imani and back again. They knew who had recruited them, who had fought to protect patient data, who had insisted that the rare disease platform remain more than a billionaire's monument to himself. But the stage had been built with Everett's name. The cameras had been invited under Everett's signature, and the opening remarks were printed on cards thick enough to feel like law. Money can make silence look professional. Imani looked down at the slim black folder in her hand, its surface smooth beneath her thumb, the sealed memorandum inside bearing 3 phrases Everett had never bothered to understand. Principal Investigator Reversion Mandate, Donor Intent Enforcement Protocol, and Operational Risk Authority. They were not dramatic words. They did not shine under stage lights or trend under hashtags. But in the right hands, they could stop a research empire without raising a voice. Consequence was already awake. The lights dimmed at 9:40 p.m., and the atrium shifted from conversation to performance. Everett stepped toward the glass podium, Camille beside him, while the city lights glittered beyond the high windows like a colder version of applause. Imani remained on the balcony, composed, beautiful, and unreadable, watching her husband prepare to take credit for the one thing he had never truly built. The lab was still breathing, but the oxygen no longer belonged to him. Everett Colefax reached the glass podium at 9:42 p.m., and the room answered him with the kind of applause money could arrange, but never make sincere. Behind him, the floor-to-ceiling windows held the city in blue fragments, Boston's high-rise lights trembling through the snow, like distant witnesses refusing to intervene. Camille Arden stood half a step to his right in champagne silk, smiling as if the laboratory, the cameras, and the 600 guests had been placed there for the benefit of her profile. He looked born to be believed. In the darker corner of the second-floor balcony, Dr. Imani Bellamy stood still beside a steel column, her face untouched by the stage glow, her black folder resting against her wrist with ceremonial calm. Below, Everett laughed softly at his own opening line, and several donors laughed with him because men like Everett trained rooms to follow their temperature. Above, Imani watched without blinking, the soft hum of the ventilation system brushing against the silence around her like cold breath. He performed warmth. She measured damage. Everett began with gratitude, naming investors from New York, Boston, and Palm Beach, thanking the Colefax Foundation, the Colefax Biomedical Board, and the Colefax Legacy Initiative as if repetition could turn branding into authorship. He spoke of my vision, my platform, and the lab I built when others said it was impossible, each phrase landing on the marble floor with a careful smile. On the east wall, a 40-foot display showed magnified neural pathways glowing in artificial blue, while beneath it the real scientists stood in a row with hands folded and faces carefully blank. No one corrected him. Camille leaned toward the microphone at 9:48 p.m. and praised Everett for bringing compassion back to medical innovation, though she mispronounced the name of the rare disease pathway printed on the teleprompter. A junior researcher near the third row lowered her eyes, and the chief data architect looked toward the balcony as if waiting for permission to breathe. Everett placed his palm lightly on Camille's back, guiding her closer to the center of the camera frame. The insult was elegant enough to be photographed. Imani's thumb moved once across the edge of the black folder, feeling the raised seal of the donor intent enforcement protocol beneath the leather grain. Inside were copies of the Foundational Research Funding Lockbox Authorization, the Biomedical Data Stewardship Authority, and a sealed notice tied to the Principal Investigator Reversion Mandate, each one reviewed by Helena Crosswick's office at 7:06 that evening. The documents did not accuse anyone. They only defined what would happen when misuse became visible. Paper can punish more quietly than anger. Everett turned to the crowd and announced that Camille would serve as the public ambassador for the next phase of the research campus, a role he described as the new heart of the mission. The phrase floated beneath the atrium lights while the snow thickened outside, turning the windows into a wall of moving white. Imani remained in the dim balcony shadow, separated from her husband by 31 feet of air, one glass railing, and 8 years of work he had just tried to rename. There it was. At 9:53 p.m., Everett lifted a crystal sample vial from its velvet display case, presenting it as a symbol of the Colefax promise, though Imani remembered buying the first plain version herself for $18.40 from a university supply catalog before any billionaire had cared about her research. The vial caught the light beautifully, empty and flawless, just like the speech around it. Everett handed it to Camille for the cameras, and she held it between two manicured fingers with a smile too bright for the room's unease. The only sound was the thin glass click of the vial against her ring. A photographer asked Camille to turn slightly left, and Everett laughed, telling the room that science needed a face people could love. The line drew polite applause from donors who mistook cruelty for charm when it wore a tailored suit. In the balcony shadow, Imani looked down at the woman wearing silk beside the man claiming her life's work, and her expression did not harden because it had already passed beyond hurt. She did not compete with what the room had mistaken for decoration. Everett's final slide appeared behind him at 9:57 p.m., naming the platform under the Colefax Biomedical banner and listing him as founding visionary, with Camille Arden added beneath as strategic public partner. 2 hours earlier, the approved founder slide had still carried Imani's title, but Everett's media team had replaced it after a private instruction from his office. Imani's name sat nowhere on the screen, not as principal architect, not as research founder, not as the woman whose scholarship-born intelligence had built the invisible foundation under every shining floor. The city lights beyond the glass flickered through the snow, cold and distant, while inside the marriage became as sterile as the lab beneath it. He erased her in public. Imani opened the folder, removed a single cream-colored page, and signed her name with a black lacquer fountain pen she had bought after her first independent grant closed at $12. $6 million. The ink moved smoothly across the activation line for the Operational Risk Authority, turning consequence from theory into process. Downstairs, Everett smiled beneath the lights. Upstairs, in the corner shadow, his wife completed the sentence he had never learned to read. The only sound was the soft scrape of the pen sealing the freeze order. Everett Colefax was still smiling at 10:01 p.m., standing beneath the white laboratory lights, as if applause could disinfect what he had just done. Camille Arden leaned toward him in champagne silk. Her reflection doubled in the glass podium and tripled in the camera lenses pointed at her face. Beyond the windows, snow crossed the Boston skyline in silver sheets, blurring the red aircraft lights on the distant towers until the city looked expensive, cold, and far away. Imani did not move. From the darker corner of the second-floor balcony, she watched Everett accept another round of polite applause, while the cream-colored activation notice rested inside her black folder like a blade no one could see. Below, Everett joked that innovation required courage, capital, and a little showmanship, and the donors laughed because the room had been trained to reward him before it understood him. Above, Imani stood beside the brushed steel column, her shadow falling across the floor in a clean vertical line, her face calm enough to make panic unnecessary. He fed the room charm. She fed the system evidence. At 10:04 p.m., Helena Crosswick entered through the north corridor, wearing a charcoal coat dusted with snow and carrying a narrow graphite case stamped only with the seal of the Research Compliance Office. She did not hurry, because authority that is real rarely needs speed. Her heels crossed the upper walkway with measured precision, passing the locked server gallery, the glass-walled tissue culture rooms, and the reception terrace where waiters quietly removed untouched espresso cups priced at $42 each. No one noticed her arrival except Imani. Everett lifted Camille's hand for the photographers, and the lenses caught the champagne sheen of her sleeve, the silver glow of the podium, and the perfect vacancy of a moment designed for public consumption. In the shadow above them, Imani gave Helena one small nod. Not a plea, not an apology, only confirmation that the threshold had been crossed. Helena opened the graphite case and placed a tablet-sized signing board against the balcony rail. The only sound was the clean magnetic click of the compliance seal unlocking. Imani removed the printed reception credential from her dress, a pale laminated slip bearing her married name, Mrs. Imani Colefax, as if the building itself had decided to make her smaller. For 1 second, she studied it under the dim balcony light, remembering every grant interview, every patient family meeting, every winter night when she had chosen ethics over speed and truth over spectacle. Then she slid the printed credential into the graphite case beside the signed Operational Risk Authority notice, where it looked less like identification than evidence. A married name can become a cage when it is used to make a woman smaller. Downstairs, Everett turned toward the balcony at last, perhaps sensing the change before understanding it, his smile still present but no longer reaching the corners of his eyes. Camille followed his gaze, still holding the empty crystal vial, her fingers tightening around it, as if the object might protect the performance from becoming real. Imani descended the central staircase slowly, each step crossing from shadow into light, while 600 guests watched a woman they had been taught to overlook become the only person in the building who did not need permission. The crowd seemed to open around her without anyone deciding to move. At 10:07 p.m., she reached the edge of the stage, close enough for Everett to smell the faint trace of jasmine and winter air on her coat. The crystal vial sat in Camille's hand, clear and hollow, the symbol Everett had tried to steal because he understood symbols better than substance. Imani extended her palm, and Camille hesitated just long enough for the cameras to catch fear pretending to be confusion. Then she gave it back. Imani placed the vial on the glass podium beside Everett's speech cards, right over the line that named him founding visionary. The hollow crystal rolled once, touched the microphone base, and stopped. The only sound was the small, final tap of empty glass against polished steel. Everett whispered her name, too softly for the microphones, but loudly enough for Camille to hear the ownership in it. Imani looked at him with no anger, no sorrow, no performance, only the settled dignity of a woman who had found the exit before the room understood the damage. Behind her, Helena Crosswick closed the graphite case containing the signed foundational research funding lockbox activation, the principal investigator reversion mandate notice, and the biomedical data stewardship authority trigger. The legal machinery had moved from warning to execution. Everett forced a laugh under the lights, telling the audience there had been a small internal formality, while in the darker aisle Imani turned from him without asking the room to believe her. She had no need to argue with a man standing on authority he could no longer prove. At the foot of the stage, she looked back once and spoke clearly enough for the front row to hear, "Revenge is loud. This is consequence." Then she walked toward the west exit, past the glass displays, past the cameras, past the warm lobby lights, and into the snow waiting beyond the glass doors. The lab doors closed behind her with a soft hydraulic sigh. By 6:12 a.m., the snow had turned Kendall Square into a pale, silent grid, and the Colefax Biomedical Research Campus looked less like a monument than a sealed instrument under glass. The city lights were still visible from the upper floors, thin yellow windows blinking across Boston's towers, while the Charles River lay dark beyond the frozen streets. Inside the executive conference suite, Everett Colefax stood beneath a ring of recessed white lights with his jacket removed, his tie loosened by half an inch, and a laugh too polished to belong to a man with 23 missed calls and 6 urgent legal notices waiting on his phone. He called it a paperwork delay. In the darker end of the same building, 2 floors below the event atrium, the main lab corridor remained quiet except for the low electrical hum of freezers, monitors, and locked server cabinets. Imani Bellamy was no longer in the building, but her authority was everywhere, in the permissions that failed, in the grant wires that paused, in the dashboards that turned from green to amber one line at a time. A junior operations analyst refreshed the funding portal at 6:19 a.m. and watched $184. $6 million in scheduled disbursements move from active release to emergency preliminary compliance hold. The room went quiet in the way only numbers can silence powerful people. Everett smiled for the emergency video call at 6:23 a.m. Telling the CFO, the general counsel, and 2 senior partners from Barlow and Finch Advisory that Helena Crosswick had overreacted to optics. Behind him, the glass wall reflected the snowy skyline and the empty champagne flutes still being cleared from the atrium below. Camille Arden sat near the far end of the conference table in a cream cashmere wrap, scrolling through social media comments that had already begun asking why Dr. Bellamy's name had not appeared on the founding slide. The lights loved Everett, the numbers did not. At 6:31 a.m., Helena Crosswick placed a sealed compliance binder on the conference table, its dark graphite cover marked with the crest of the Independent Donor Consortium and 3 stamped phrases: Foundational Research Funding Lockbox, Donor Intent Enforcement Protocol, Biomedical Data Stewardship Authority. She spoke without raising her voice, explaining that the prior night's public misattribution had triggered a mandatory review under the restricted use endowment structure. No grant capital, donor match funds, or translational research reserves could move until principal stewardship, data custody, and ethical use declarations were reconciled. Consequence had a receipt. Everett leaned back and gave a short laugh under the clean ceiling lights, insisting that donors did not freeze a billion-dollar platform over one speech, one slide, and one disputed founding record. In the darker glass reflection behind Helena, the lab floor below showed technicians standing beside idle equipment, their blue nitrile gloves still on, their morning protocols unopened. At that exact moment, Imani sat in a quiet legal office on Newberry Street, 7 miles away, watching snow slide down a tall window while the city's early lights glowed against the wet, black road. She did not smile. At 6:44 a.m., her attorney, Marin Vale, placed a black lacquer fountain pen beside the final acknowledgement page for the Operational Risk Authority execution packet. Imani reviewed the language once, not because she doubted it, but because she had learned long ago that power was most dangerous when it rushed. The packet did not mention betrayal, marriage, humiliation, or Camille. It mentioned fiduciary misuse, scientific misattribution, donor intent breach, and temporary suspension of controlled biomedical assets pending verification. The law did not need her pain. Everett's counsel tried to argue that the Colefax name on the building gave him operational discretion, but Helena turned to page 32 and read the line that ended the room's confidence. Any public claim inconsistent with principal research stewardship could activate a preemptive capital freeze across all restricted biomedical accounts. Camille stopped scrolling. At 6:52 a.m., Imani signed the acknowledgement in black ink, her name steady beneath the title Principal Steward and Founding Research Architect. The pen moved across the page with a softness that felt almost gentle, though the effect would reach every server room, donor account, procurement queue, and pharmaceutical partner tied to the platform. The only sound was the dry whisper of paper accepting her signature. At 7:03 a.m., the campus finance screens changed again. Payroll protected, patient care obligations preserved, executive expansion suspended, media spending halted, discretionary lab procurement frozen, and all Colefax-controlled narrative releases locked for compliance review. Everett stared at the red-line dashboard while the atrium below still glittered with last night's rented lights. In the darkened Newberry Street office, Imani closed the folder and looked out at the snow-covered city, where office towers were beginning to wake like cold witnesses. She had not destroyed the lab. She had removed his permission to pretend he owned its soul. At 8:18 a.m., Boston snow had turned from soft flakes into thin, icy rain, streaking the windows of the Newberry Street office where Dr. Imani Bellamy sat beneath a brass reading lamp and reviewed the second layer of her reclamation file. Across the city, the Colefax Biomedical Research Campus still glowed against the gray morning, its upper floors reflecting the pale lights of office towers that looked warm from a distance and merciless up close. Everett Colefax stood under the conference suite lights with a cup of untouched boutique coffee in his hand, smiling through another emergency call, as if charm could reopen frozen accounts. He kept performing control. In the darker quiet of Marinvale's office, Imani turned to the section marked Principal Investigator Reversion Mandate and rested her fingertips on the page without haste. The document named her not as a spouse, not as a supporter, not as a decorative witness to wealth, but as founding research architect and principal steward of the rare disease platform. It transferred stewardship of the underlying analytic models, clinical trial design frameworks, biomarker classification methods, and protected research protocols back to her office pending independent verification. Her maiden name returned first in ink. At 8:27 a.m., Helena Crosswick's secure notice reached the campus data team, and 12 internal dashboards changed status within 90 seconds. The machine learning repository moved into read-only custody. The neural mapping source environment entered steward review, and the patient data simulation engine disconnected from Colefax executive credentials under the Biomedical Data Stewardship Authority. Payroll remained untouched, active patient obligations remained protected, and essential lab preservation funds stayed open, because Imani had not come to punish the vulnerable for Everett's vanity. She knew the difference between justice and damage. Downstairs at the campus, Everett laughed too loudly beneath the clean ceiling lights when the chief technology officer said the source environment no longer recognized his executive override. Camille Arden sat beside him in cream silk, tapping one manicured nail against a glass table, her face tightening each time another system rejected the Colefax administrative key. Outside the conference room, a corridor of young scientists stood near the vending alcove, whispering beside a $4.75 bottle of water and a tray of untouched pastries from a Cambridge bakery. The building was full of brilliant people waiting for permission to continue work he had never understood. At 8:39 a.m., Imani signed the reversion mandate acceptance packet with the same black lacquer fountain pen she had used before dawn. Marin slid a second folder toward her, this one bearing the name that made Imani pause for half a breath, Bellamy Institute for Women's Medical Equity. It was not a revenge vehicle, not a vanity foundation, not a polished shell for donor applause. It was a restricted-purpose medical equity entity designed to fund women researchers from low-income backgrounds, underdiagnosed female patients, and ethical trial access for communities long treated as footnotes. The future carried the name she had owned before Colefax ever touched it. On the campus screen, Everett's PR director proposed a statement claiming the freeze was temporary and collaborative, while the legal counsel warned that any misleading narrative could trigger the donor intent enforcement protocol and expand the review to all public communications. Everett smiled at the room, but the smile had become a thin corporate reflex, a shape his face remembered after his authority had left. Camille asked whether the press could be shifted toward her charity profile instead, and 3 executives looked away at the same time. Emptiness always seeks better lighting. In the Newberry Street office, Imani opened a small paper sleeve and removed the faded locker tag from her first graduate research station at Johns Hopkins, a relic worth almost nothing and everything at once. She placed it beside the Bellamy Institute filing papers, next to a projected initial reserve of $61 per million redirected from her private donor-advised medical equity fund. The rain clicked against the window while the city lights faded into morning, and for the first time since the lab event, Imani allowed herself one slow breath. The only sound was the firm press of the notary seal closing over the Bellamy name. At 8:56 a.m., the first invitation letters went out to 12 women researchers in Baltimore, Atlanta, Detroit, Oakland, Jackson, and rural Maine, each offering protected funding, ethical mentorship, and research independence outside the shadow of billionaires who confused ownership with wisdom. At the same minute, Everett's campus received notice that no Colefax-branded release could claim the rare disease platform until principal stewardship was resolved. Under the lights, he kept smiling at a room that no longer believed him. In the quiet office, Imani watched her maiden name become an institution. She had not taken back a building. She had taken back the reason it deserved to exist. By the 3rd week of January, Boston had settled into a hard winter, the kind that turned curbside slush black by noon and made the city lights look sharper from every high window after 5 p.m. The Colefax Biomedical Research Campus still glowed above Athenaeum Street, its glass walls washed in blue-white light, but the brightness had begun to feel like an empty showroom after the buyers had left. Inside the executive suite, Everett Colefax stood beneath the same polished ceiling lights, laughing through a call with Zurich partners as though the pause in funding were merely a weather delay, a temporary inconvenience, a small administrative cloud passing over $1 billion horizon. No one laughed back. 14 floors below, the wet snow slid down the lab windows in uneven lines, blurring the reflection of silent centrifuges, powered-down imaging bays, and sealed storage cabinets marked for compliance preservation only. Researchers moved carefully through the corridors with clipboards and quiet faces, no longer rushing toward discovery, only documenting what could not legally proceed. The restricted use endowment remained locked under the Foundational Research Funding lockbox. The Biomedical Data Stewardship Authority kept the source environment in steward review, and the Donor Intent Enforcement Protocol prevented Colefax communications from dressing paralysis as progress. The building had light, but no pulse. At 5:37 p.m., Everett entered Conference Room A with a practiced smile, wearing a charcoal-tailored suit and the same confidence he used to bring into television studios. Camille Arden sat to his left in a cream silk dress beneath a cashmere coat, scrolling through invitations that had quietly stopped arriving, her attention lifting only when someone mentioned press optics. On the wall screen, the first formal withdrawal appeared from Meridian Helix Therapeutics, a $220 million development partner that had decided to suspend participation pending principal stewardship verification. The room heard the future closing. Everett leaned back under the bright lights and joked that European partners always loved dramatic language. But his CFO did not smile, his legal counsel did not blink, and Helena Crosswick, seated at the far end of the table, simply placed a blue folder beside her tablet. In the darker reflection of the glass wall behind him, the lab floors looked like a ship moving without an engine through storm water. Across the city, in the quieter top floor of the Bellamy Institute's temporary office on Boylston Street, Imani Bellamy sat beside a rain-dark window reviewing the first cohort applications from women researchers in Detroit, Atlanta, Baltimore, and rural Maine. Her office had no ceremonial chandelier, no media stage, no silver name installed for vanity. It had a long oak table, a $29 ceramic mug of cooling tea, and a view of office towers glowing through sleet. She read slowly, because every name on the list deserved more attention than Everett had ever given to the truth. This was how repair began. At 5:49 p.m., the second withdrawal arrived from Eastbridge Clinical Systems, followed by a conditional pause from North Beacon University Medical School 9 minutes later. Each notice used careful language: stewardship uncertainty, data custody limitations, reputational exposure, unresolved ethical use declarations, and sponsor governance instability under the Operational Risk Authority. Those words did not sound emotional, but they cut deeper than accusation because they came from institutions that understood risk better than loyalty. Everett's smile held for 5 seconds after the third notice, then disappeared as if someone had turned off a screen. The only sound was the brittle crack of his silver pen cap splitting under his thumb. Camille looked up sharply, not because he was upset, but because the broken pen had marked the cuff of his white shirt with a thin line of black ink. She asked whether they could shift the narrative toward her wellness initiative, maybe stage a hospital visit, maybe give the press a softer image to chase. The chief medical officer closed his eyes, and the head of research turned toward the window where snow struck the glass with small wet taps. Everett did not correct Camille, because correcting her would mean admitting he had placed emptiness beside him and called it strategy. He had mistaken attention for rescue. At 6:08 p.m., Helena opened the blue folder and informed the room that 2 additional donor families had invoked enhanced oversight rights under the Donor Intent Enforcement Protocol. That meant independent review would now extend beyond the rare disease platform into executive spending, public statements, grant allocation history, and any media campaign that represented research stewardship inaccurately. Everett stared at her as though dignity had betrayed him by becoming procedural. Helena's voice remained level. In the Bellamy office, Imani signed 12 protected funding letters for the Institute's first scholars, each one carrying a 3-year guarantee, ethics mentorship, and independent data review support. Outside her window, the city lights burned gold through the winter rain, and her reflection looked calm enough to be mistaken for peace. She had not watched Colefax collapse in real time. She had chosen to build where no one had to borrow power from a man's surname. The only sound was the clean slide of each signed letter entering its envelope. At 6:26 p.m., Everett's PR director finally said the sentence no one had wanted to own. Without Imani's stewardship clearance, no major partner would risk returning. Camille pushed back from the table, whispering that none of this was supposed to touch her name. Everett looked at the screen, at the withdrawals, at the frozen accounts, at the lab glowing below him like a museum of his arrogance. Under the lights, he had nothing left to perform. In the quiet across town, Imani was already funding the women he once would have ignored. By February 11th, the snow outside the Colefax Biomedical Research Campus had hardened into gray ridges along Athenaeum Street, and every evening after 5:30 p.m., the glass building reflected Boston's city lights like a crown no one wanted to wear. Everett Colefax still entered through the west lobby beneath the polished white ceiling, still nodded to security, still gave the kind of practiced half-smile designed for cameras that were no longer waiting. Camille Arden walked beside him in a cream silk dress under a pale wool coat, her heels clicking across the marble with the sharp impatience of someone discovering that proximity to power did not guarantee shelter. The building looked rich, the rooms felt abandoned. In conference room A, Everett stood under a bright circle of recessed light and told the remaining executives that the media cycle would soften if they projected unity, optimism, and philanthropic discipline. His voice carried the old rhythm, the one that had once moved donors, reporters, and board members toward whatever version of truth he preferred. But the long table had empty chairs now, for senior researchers had resigned within 9 days, and the legal team had begun labeling every public statement under sponsor governance exposure review. Performance had become paperwork. 3 miles away, in a quieter Boylston Street office where the winter rain tapped against tall windows, Dr. Imani Bellamy sat in the dim amber glow of a desk lamp, reading a letter from a neurologist in Jackson who had nearly left research after losing funding twice to Better Connected Men. Outside, High-rise lights burned through the sleet, gold squares stacked against a blue-black sky, while her tea went cold beside a neat row of signed scholar agreements. She did not watch Everett's interviews, did not answer private numbers, and did not ask who was still loyal to the name Colefax. She had better work now. At 6:07 p.m., Camille finally broke the polished silence inside conference room A by asking whether the lab could just rebrand the science and move forward with a more emotional patient-facing campaign. The chief data architect stared at her for 2 full seconds before explaining, carefully, that one could not rebrand restricted biomedical data, principal stewardship, source code provenance, or donor intent obligations as if they were a fragrance launch. Helena Crosswick sat at the far end of the table, her graphite folder closed, her expression unchanged, while Everett gave a small laugh under the lights as though Camille had only been thinking creatively. No one rescued the moment. Camille's face tightened when the head of clinical partnerships confirmed that North Beacon University Medical School had not merely paused. It had formally redirected its advisory resources toward an independent collaboration with the Bellamy Institute for Women's Medical Equity. The announcement landed with less drama than a dropped glass, but it emptied the room faster than shouting ever could. Everett looked toward Helena, then toward the windows where wet snow slid down the dark glass and turned the city lights into broken yellow lines. He had lost the room before he lost the company. At 6:19 p.m., Camille pushed back from the table and said she had never agreed to become the face of a compliance investigation. She spoke about her reputation, her invitations, her charity luncheons, and the glossy magazine profile that had been postponed after the funding freeze entered public filings. Not once did she mention patients, researchers, data integrity, or the families whose future trials had been delayed by Everett's vanity while active care remained protected. Her emptiness finally had no music under it. Everett tried to calm her with a low voice and a smile, but under the conference lights his charm looked thin, almost administrative. In the darker reflection of the glass wall, he could see the lab floors below, sealed cold rooms, idle imaging systems, technicians moving like quiet shadows, and the blue glow of monitors that still refused his access. Camille removed the diamond bracelet he had given her after the launch rehearsal, placed it on the table beside her untouched sparkling water, and stood. The only sound was the cold clink of diamonds meeting glass. She told him that he had promised her a future, not a scandal dressed in medical language. Everett said nothing because the word scandal was easier for her than stewardship breach, easier than principal investigator reversion mandate, easier than biomedical data stewardship authority, easier than admitting that he had built his stage on a foundation belonging to the woman he dismissed. Camille walked out with her coat over one arm, leaving the bracelet behind like a receipt for the part she had played. The doors closed softly. At 6:34 p.m., Helena opened her folder and read the newest notice from the donor consortium. Enhanced oversight would now include executive misrepresentation review, narrative control expenditures, and any attempt to assign scientific leadership to unqualified public ambassadors. Everett let out a short laugh beneath the lights, but it sounded detached from him, a reflex from a former life. In the dim Boylston office, Imani signed the Bellamy Institute's first collaborative research memorandum with North Beacon, placing 3 women-led labs under protected 3-year funding and independent ethics review. The only sound was the smooth pressure of her pen crossing the final stewardship line. Outside her window, rain and snow blurred the city into silver and gold, while across Boston, Everett stared at the empty chair Camille had left behind. He had chosen a woman who loved the spotlight and discarded the woman who understood the switch. Now the light was still shining, but no one was standing there for him. 3 years later, at 7:18 p.m., on a cold November evening in Geneva, rain moved across the tall windows of the International Forum for Medical Equity, turning the city lights along Quai du Mont Blanc into long gold threads on the black surface of Lake Geneva. The venue was a glass-walled medical conference hall suspended above the water, filled with physicians, university presidents, donor families, and women researchers wearing printed name credentials that represented laboratories from Boston, Nairobi, Atlanta, Seoul, and Sao Paulo. At the center of the stage stood Dr. Imani Bellamy, elegant in a deep midnight blue gown, her posture calm, her face luminous under the soft white lights, not because she had been rescued by wealth, but because she had learned to make wealth answer to purpose. She had become undeniable. On the far left of the hall, half hidden behind a column near the service entrance, Everett Colefax stood in a dark suit that still cost more than most people's rent, smiling faintly when an old acquaintance recognized him, though the smile no longer carried the authority it once did. Under the lights, Imani received the Aurelia Prize for ethical biomedical stewardship. In the shadowed margin, Everett adjusted his cuff and pretended the room had not already chosen its history without him. The split between them was almost architectural. She stood in public honor, while he lingered in private consequence. No camera turned for him. The presenter listed what the Bellamy Institute for Women's Medical Equity had built in 36 months. $214 million in protected research funding, 68 women-led lab grants, 14 rural diagnostic access programs, and a patient data equity framework now adopted by 5 teaching hospitals. Each number landed cleanly, not like applause for survival, but like proof of design. Behind Imani, a screen showed no luxury branding, no family crest, no vanity slogan, only the names of scholars and clinics funded under the Bellamy Stewardship Charter, the Equity Capital Preservation Covenant, and the Independent Data Integrity Authority. Her name had become infrastructure. Everett watched from the dim side aisle while rain crossed the glass behind her and the city lights trembled over the lake like reflections of a life he had not been invited to rewrite. He remembered the Boston lab, the snow on Athenaeum Street, Camille's champagne silk, the hollow crystal vial, the funding screens turning amber and red, the moment he had laughed because he still believed laughter could outrun consequence. The memory did not arrive as drama. It arrived as accounting. Regret has no spotlight. At 7:31 p.m., Imani accepted the award with both hands, a slim piece of cut glass shaped like an open door, and for 1 second the lights caught its edge so sharply that the hall seemed to hold its breath. She spoke about women whose research had been dismissed until someone profitable repeated it, about patients whose pain had been undercounted because the data had been built around someone else, about institutions that called fairness expensive until unfairness became a liability. Her voice was steady, low, and American in its restraint, shaped by Baltimore classrooms, Boston winters, and every quiet room where she had chosen precision over rage. The only sound was the soft chime of the glass award touching the lectern. Everett lowered his eyes. Near the front row, Helena Crosswick, now chair of an international ethics council, watched Imani with the faintest smile, her graphite folder replaced by a silver program embossed with Bellamy's name. Several former Colefax researchers sat beside her as honored guests, no longer whispering in hallways, no longer waiting for permission to tell the truth. When Imani announced a new $50 million protected fellowship for women from working-class families entering biomedical research, the hall rose before the sentence fully ended. The applause had weight. In the side shadow, Everett tried to clap, but his hands stopped after 3 quiet strikes, as if the body could not perform respect faster than the soul could earn it. He had once believed he made rooms important by entering them. Now he understood that Imani had made rooms safer by leaving his. Outside, rain thickened against the glass, and Geneva's lights blurred into silver, gold, and cold blue. On stage, Imani stood beneath the clean brightness without needing revenge, because revenge belonged to the past and consequence had already completed its work. She did not look toward Everett, not once, and that absence did what anger never could. It released her. At 8:06 p.m., after the applause in Geneva had faded into the soft clink of coffee cups and low professional conversations, Dr. Imani Bellamy stepped away from the stage and walked toward the glass corridor overlooking Lake Geneva, where rain slid down the windows and the city lights stretched across the black water like gold threads pulled through silk. Behind her, the Aurelia Prize rested in a velvet-lined case, and beside it lay the signed announcement of the Bellamy Global Stewardship Fund, a $50 million protected fellowship program built under the Equity Capital Preservation Covenant and the Independent Data Integrity Authority. She had answered every part of the promise the world once doubted. Everett Colefax had claimed her research lab as his own, and she had quietly frozen the funding, not to destroy science, but to protect it from vanity. Consequence had kept its word. Everett found her near the end of the corridor, standing just outside the main reception hall, where the bright event lights no longer reached fully and the rain made a soft silver curtain against the glass. He looked older than he had on Athenaeum Street, not ruined in a theatrical way, but reduced by the long accounting of his own choices. His suit was still expensive, his shoes still polished, his voice still careful, yet none of it carried the force it once had inside rooms trained to reward him. He had finally arrived without an audience. Imani turned before he spoke, not startled, not pleased, not afraid, only present in the quiet way of a woman who had already survived the version of him that needed a stage. Everett said he had watched the award, watched the researchers stand for her, watched former Colefax partners applaud the institute that had grown from the authority he never thought she possessed. He admitted, slowly, that he had called the lab his because he believed money could turn proximity into ownership. The rain answered first. He told her the campus never recovered after the freeze, not fully, even when the lights stayed on and the building kept its name. The foundational research funding lockbox had stopped the disbursements. The principal investigator reversion mandate had returned the underlying research stewardship to her, and the Biomedical Data Stewardship Authority had locked the source environment until the truth was written into the record. Partners left, donors demanded oversight. Camille vanished as soon as the cameras no longer knew how to flatter her, and the empire he had polished for years became a case study in what happens when reputation outruns integrity. The only sound was the faint click of Everett's wedding ring touching the metal railing as his hand lowered. Imani listened without interrupting, because dignity did not require her to deny him the truth once he was finally ready to say it. He said he was sorry for making her invisible, sorry for calling her support when she had been the architecture, sorry for placing a decorative woman under the lights while the Real founder stood in the dark. He said he had mistaken her silence for permission and her grace for weakness. Then, with the careful desperation of a man who had rehearsed the sentence too late, he asked whether there was any version of their life that could begin again. Imani looked through the rain-streaked glass toward the city lights, remembering Boston, the snow, the hollow crystal vial, the signing board, and the printed credential with a married name that had tried to make her smaller. She had once loved him, and that truth did not embarrass her. Love had been real, but so had the erasure, and maturity meant refusing to confuse forgiveness with return. She had not built the Bellamy Institute to prove he was wrong. She had built it because girls in borrowed shoes still needed doors that no one could close from a podium. Everett waited for anger, but she gave him peace instead, which was heavier. Imani told him she forgave him, not because the harm had vanished, and not because public regret erased private humiliation, but because she refused to let his choices remain a tenant in her future. She thanked him for teaching her that a name could be taken, a stage could be stolen, a speech could lie, and still the truth could survive if it had been built into the structure. Then she stepped back from the railing, calm beneath the corridor's soft white light, while the rain blurred his reflection behind hers. Everett whispered that he missed his wife. Imani answered with the finality of a closed file and the mercy of a free woman. You lost her. She walked back toward the reception hall, where women researchers were waiting with questions, gratitude, and work that mattered more than old wounds. Everett remained by the glass, no longer smiling, no longer performing, understanding at last that she had not punished him by leaving. She had simply stopped funding the illusion that he owned what she had built. And maybe that was the quietest form of justice. Not shouting, not begging, not breaking, but becoming so complete that the person who erased you can no longer find a place in your life. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.